Is this the last dance for Igor Shesterkin with the New York Rangers? We discuss.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1153 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And that intro song that you just heard a second ago was Leave the Lights On from our good friends in Passafire. You can check those guys out anywhere you get your music. So it's our Friday episode. We've got the Rangers preseason finale a little bit later tonight against the New York Islanders. It's going to be something of a dress rehearsal for the Rangers. But today what I wanted to do is continue our offseason series. The Everydayers know we do this every year. We basically just take a look at every single player projected to make the New York Rangers opening night roster and go through all the best case scenarios and the worst case scenarios for those players. We're getting toward the end of it here. I want to shift our attention today to the two goalies, Igor Shesterkin and Jonathan Quick. We got three more defensemen to cover. We'll circle back to them in due time. Jacob Trouba, Braden Schneider, and Zach Jones. But for today, it's going to be all about the goalies, and we will start with Igor Shesterkin. And I think in a worst-case scenario for all of us, maybe not so much Igor, but for Ranger fans that want to see Igor Shesterkin locked up long-term and want to see him be a Ranger for life, hopefully at a somewhat reasonable price. More on that in a little bit. But for all of us, everybody that's in that group that want to see Igor Shesterkin with the Rangers beyond this upcoming year, a worst-case scenario involves Igor Shesterkin quite simply not signing a contract extension before the start of the season. Of course, we're getting pretty close to the start here. We're down to less than a week. It's Thursday afternoon as I'm recording this. So, I mean, never say never. It could still happen. We do see sometimes, teams will strike a deal at the 0 hour when it comes to a contract extension. One of the more notable Ranger examples of that was a few years ago at the trade deadline. Rangers had to either trade or re-sign Chris Kreider, and they got the extension done. So something similar could happen with Igor Shesterkin, although it's certainly not guaranteed, and it's entirely possible that he plays out this upcoming season on the final year of his deal, and he'll take his chances in free agency after that. And if that happens, it's a worst case scenario for us, because it does start to get a little scary if an extension is not agreed upon between the Rangers and Igor Shesterkin before this upcoming season begins. I think also in a worst case scenario for Igor Shesterkin, excuse me, he gets into another midseason slump that we've seen kind of creep into his game a little bit the past two seasons. 3 years ago was the ridiculous Vezina winning video game numbers season that he had. And I even said at the time, I don't think it's fair to hold Igor Shesterkin or any goalie really in NHL history to that kind of a standard year in and year out, where they're just completely dialed in, lights out, brilliant the entire way from the start of the regular season through the final game of the playoffs. I just don't think it's fair to hold somebody to those kinds of standards. But what we have seen in the last two seasons, and it's happened once in each of the last two seasons. 2 years ago, it happened in, I want to say it was like November, December. And then this past year, it occurred in January. So a little bit later this past season. But we do see Igor Shesterkin go into what we can only describe as a slump. He not only is not performing to the best of his abilities, but he actually becomes at least something of a liability for not a large portion of the season, but at least a small chunk of the season. That has now happened in each of the past two seasons. Fortunately, this past year, Jonathan Quick kind of came to the rescue, and he at one point started 3 straight games while they worked with Igor Shesterkin, so that was awesome to see. We're going to talk about Jonathan Quick a little bit later in today's episode as well, but I think in a worst-case scenario, we'll see that kind of creep back in for Igor Shesterkin. And the fact that it has now happened 2 years in a row, I don't think it can be ruled out as far as potentially happening, for this upcoming season. I hope I'm wrong. But yeah, in a worst case scenario, that certainly creeps back into his game. It's entirely possible that he can avoid this as well, because again, the proof is in the pudding. You look back at 2021, 2022, that was coast to coast brilliance for the entire season for Igor Shesterkin, which is basically what it takes to win a Vezina. And that is, of course, exactly what he did during that season. I think also in a worst case scenario, this one's a little bit more lighthearted, but there's some truth to it as well. I think in a worst case scenario, Igor Shesterkin continues to get into a couple of post-whistle scuffles. It's never been like he's been completely out of control or a total hothead, but we have seen situations in recent seasons where there will be a whistle. Maybe somebody runs Igor. Maybe somebody kind of accidentally on purpose falls on top of Igor Shesterkin. Looking at you, Nick Ritchie. But we have seen situations like that, and then Igor will get mad. And there was it this year in the playoffs? Maybe against the Canes or the Panthers? Somebody fell on Igor in the crease, and he kind of took a swipe at them, and I think actually got a penalty for it. So I feel like that's been happening more the longer that Igor's been in the league. We didn't see a whole lot of that when he first got to the NHL, and that probably stands to reason a little bit because he's more comfortable now and probably a little bit more apt to do something like that now that he's kind of established himself as a premier goalie in this league, which is exactly what he's done. But yeah, worst case scenario, he continues to kind of get involved with that kind of stuff. Not that he can't handle himself and not that we don't ever want to see him stick up for himself, but you never know what can happen. When you've got a situation, giant pushing match, 5-on-5, all the skaters on the ice come together and everybody's pushing and shoving, maybe one or two fights break out. You don't want to see Igor get in the middle of that and then somebody falls on top of him, falls on his leg, he falls awkwardly, whatever the situation might be. Not ideal. You certainly don't want to see your goalie, much less a goalie the caliber of Igor Shesterkin, get injured during some extracurriculars after the whistle. So with Igor, he's been awesome, obviously, ever since he's debuted, and it's not easy to come up with worst case scenarios, but I did my best there with that. So in just a minute, we're going to turn our attention to some best case scenarios for Igor Shesterkin, and there's quite a few of those. And we will eventually work our way to Jonathan Quick as well. Gonna do all that fun stuff right here in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That is FanDuel.com. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Huge shout out, as always, to the everydayers. Really appreciate you guys sticking with Locked On New York Rangers throughout the entire offseason and now the preseason. And of course, the regular season is right upon us as well. In our next episode, going to be breaking down everything that happens in Friday's game between the Rangers and the Islanders. That is, of course, the preseason finale. And as I mentioned earlier, we got 3 more defensemen to cover before the season starts in our best and worst case scenarios series. And then, of course, obviously Wednesday night, Rangers Penguins to start the season. And we'll obviously break down everything that happens there. And hopefully we're talking about the Rangers starting the season 1-0. But for right now, let's go ahead, shift our attention to the best case scenarios for Igor Shesterkin. So we're going to start with some of the contract stuff. And I know there's some Ranger fans. A lot of people have a lot of different opinions on Igor Shesterkin and how much is he really worth, and should we really pay a goalie this much money, and should we just meet his demands and just make sure he's under contract one way or another? What's the best way to do this, right? I think in a best case scenario, and let me, again, preface this by saying that I do want Igor Shesterkin locked up, and I don't really have a problem with him being the highest paid goalie in the NHL because this is how it goes. These contracts tend to go up and up and up as the seasons progress here. So if you want to give him 1 cent more than what Carey Price is currently making, you can do that. I don't have an issue with that. And you got to keep in mind also the salary cap should continue to rise in the seasons going forward here. So that contract won't be as much of a burden as I think a lot of people might believe that it will be. Obviously, every penny counts when it comes to the NHL salary cap, but be that as it may, I think he is worth paying that much. But in a best case scenario, I think the Rangers at least hold their ground when it comes to contract negotiations with Igor Shesterkin. They don't just cave in, meet his every demand, give him $12 million a season, $12.5 million a season, $13 million a season. That's getting a little bit nuts, and that's quite a bit more than what any other goalie currently playing in this league is currently making per season. One way to do that, if you're the Rangers, and this goes back to what I was saying in the previous section, is to play a little bit of hardball the same way that it seems like Igor and his camp are playing a little bit of hardball. And if I can explain that, Igor, we don't really know what his priorities are. It's entirely possible that he's keeping that close to the vest, and the Rangers don't even know that either. It's entirely possible that Igor Shesterkin, like a lot of professional athletes, will simply go to the highest bidder, the team that offers him the most money. And while that would be unfortunate, and while I do think Igor could give the Rangers a little bit of a break, That's what a lot of players do, and we hear about how this is a business, so I don't really begrudge players when they, do that. They stake out on their own and, look to get themselves as good of a payday as they possibly can. However, I get the feeling in a perfect world, a perfect world for Igor Shesterkin, he gets paid by the Rangers. I don't see any real reason why he would want to leave this team. He's been wholeheartedly welcomed by the Ranger fans. I mean, Ranger fans love this guy. He replaced a legend, and nevertheless, the fans still welcomed him with open arms. He's had a ton of success here. He's been phenomenal in the playoffs. The Rangers, while he's been here, have gone from a rebuilding team to a bona fide Stanley Cup contender. So, and it's the only team he's ever played for. So I don't think that Igor would want to go somewhere else necessarily. Like if every team in the NHL made him the exact same offer, I get the feeling he would stay with the New York Rangers. I don't know that for sure, but that's kind of what I think would probably happen. But getting back to the point I was making here. So if Igor wants to play hardball with the Rangers and wants to try to squeeze every dime out of them that he possibly can, the Rangers could throw it back at him a little bit, because something I've been talking about on here off and on throughout the entire offseason, because obviously Igor signing a contract extension is one of the biggest storylines. But something that I've been talking about on here is that if Igor makes it to free agency next offseason, then yes, he theoretically will get more leverage on the Rangers because he can now talk to all these other teams. However, something to keep in mind, the other side of that, and it's something that I haven't really discussed on here, at that same time, the Rangers will be able to talk to other goalies and not just Igor Shesterkin. And when you look at the list of free agent goalies, it's not an enormous list, but there's some, quality options available here. And we have gone through this list before, but I think it bears repeating. Obviously, Igor himself will be an unrestricted free agent. Linus Ullmark is a UFA at the end of the season. Stanley Cup champion Adin Hill, UFA at the end of the season. Freddie Anderson, UFA at the end of the season. He's had some injury problems, and he is getting a little bit older. He's now 34, but I would say at least somebody that you keep an eye on, if you're the Rangers and you do need a new goalie, and I hope that it doesn't come to that, but he's somebody that I think you at least, do your due diligence on. Our old friend Alex Georgiev, he is a UFA at the end of the season. Another one that, not really a household name, but he's somebody that's played some good hockey for the Kraken. Joey Decord, he's a UFA at the end of the season. Jake Ottinger is an RFA with arbitration rights, so I get the feeling he'll probably be staying with Dallas. And Jeremy Swayman, he is on very, very bad terms with his current team, the Bruins, right now. He is currently a restricted free agent with arbitration rights. So it's entirely possible that he's made available in a trade at one time or another, maybe next offseason, who knows. But the bottom line, there are other goalies there. And if Igor wants to play hardball, and I'm going to wait until free agency and see what's out there, the Rangers can do that too. Because if Igor wants to stay with the Rangers, then there is a looming threat, if we go all the way to free agency, that the Rangers could sign one of these other goalies. And if that happens, all of a sudden, Igor Shesterkin is going to be out of a job here. Now, again, I don't want that to happen, but that is a way, depending on how much hardball the Rangers want to play and how much Drury wants to really kind of dig in here. That is a way to hopefully keep the contract at a reasonable number with Igor Shesterkin. We will see. Now, as I've said, all this is to say that I don't want this to happen. I don't want to be in a situation where it gets ugly or it gets really tense during next offseason and we're not sure if Igor's going to stay or not. I still want the Rangers to pay Igor Shesterkin. I still believe they will pay Igor Shesterkin. And in a best case scenario for me, Igor still signs an extension before the start of the season. Once again, it is Thursday as I'm recording this. We are 6 days away from opening night. We can talk about all these other goalies that I just mentioned that are going to be available, free agents, trade possibilities, whatever it might be. And look, if the Rangers were to sign one of those guys, maybe they could, save $1.5 million, $2 million, $2.5 million per season. That's all true. But you know what, man? Igor's our guy. Igor's the guy that the Rangers drafted, 4th round pick, comes in, has an impossible task. That's another thing. I don't think Igor gets nearly enough credit for the fact that he had to replace a legend, and not just replace him, but they were on the same team together. Igor's first season was Lundqvist's last season. You had that awkward situation where Lundqvist and Georgiev and Igor were all on the roster at the same time. So one of them always had to be a healthy scratch. Everything was weird that year. That was the COVID year, the bubble playoffs and everything. And Igor handled himself very well through that and has obviously gone on to be a phenomenal goalie ever since then. But yeah, I mean, do you really want to bring in like Swayman from the Bruins or like Aiden Hill or Freddie. And these are not the Rangers. These are not the Ranger goalies. Igor's the homegrown guy and the guy that stepped up big when this team has needed him the most, namely in the playoffs. So in the best case scenario for me, that long-term extension for Igor Shesterkin still gets signed before the season begins. And I think if you're the Rangers, the best thing you can do with that is you give him the 8 years because he's 28 right now. That'll take him up to age 36, which is not bad. That's not ancient. We've seen goalies at that age continue to perform well. Maybe in the last year of his contract, he's kind of like in a timeshare if he's still on the Rangers by then. I think the other thing that you do here, and some people are not going to like this, but I don't care that this is what you're going to have to do. You give him a full no move clause for the majority of the contract, if not the entire contract. Because again, that's a way to sweeten the pot for Igor and keep the average annual value as low as possible. So I'm okay doing that as well. I think in a best case scenario, give this man 8 years at $10.5 million and 1 cent per season, because that would make him the highest paid goalie. Carey Price, the previously highest paid goalie up until Igor's next contract, was making $10.5 million per season. So highest paid goalie in hockey. I feel like that should be enough to get the job done, but we'll see how everything goes with the Rangers. It's possible. Maybe they do it for less than that. Maybe, like I said, Drury really digs in, plays some hardball with Igor, and gets him signed for 7 figures rather than 8 figures, but we shall see. 7 per season, obviously, not the total value of the contract. But enough about the contract stuff. What about the on-ice stuff? Well, he's going to be here, obviously as a member of the Rangers for this upcoming season. In a best-case scenario, how about another Vezina Award for Igor Shesterkin? When you look at the last 3 seasons from least recent to most recent, Igor won the Vezina. He came in 8th place for the Vezina, and then this past year came in 4th place for the Vezina. He's fully capable. There's a lot of really fantastic goalies in this league, but I feel like it's harder now than ever to pick out, okay, but who's the best? I would make a strong case for Igor Shesterkin, although when you look at 4th in the Vezina last year, 8th in the Vezina the year before that, you can't, that's kind of hard to make that case, right? Connor Hellebuck is somebody that's certainly in the mix as well. There's a bunch of great goalies out there. There really are. And I feel like, Igor is certainly capable of being at the top of that mountain at the end of this season, but we'll see. I think in a perfect world, that's what happens. But then again, if he wins another Vezina, now his asking prices could go up even higher. So we'll see. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and root against Igor having a great season and not winning a Vezina, but that is kind of the side effect of that as well. And if he is going to win the Vezina, this goes back to something I was talking about earlier. He's got to avoid the midseason slump, because if you go through the kind of funk that Igor did in January or the year before that, the kind of funk that he had in November and December, that pretty much takes you out of the Vezina running. He just can't afford to be, down bad for, an entire month and expect to win the Vezina, because there will be a goalie in the league where that will not happen, and that'll be your Vezina winner. I think also in a best case scenario, Igor shores up the high glove side. I don't think this is like a glaring weakness in his game, but it does feel like when things go bad and he starts giving up goals, it does feel like teams, kind of attack that area for Igor Shesterkin. So in a best case scenario, he shores that up a little bit. I think also in a best case scenario, we get playoff Igor. I don't know that the Rangers can win the cup if this does not happen. Now, that's not to say, that's not a knock on the Rangers. I feel that way about pretty much every team. It is very, very difficult to make it through 4 rounds of the Stanley Cup playoffs if you're getting average to subpar goaltending. I mean, subpar goaltending, you can basically forget it. If you got a goalie who's an enormous liability and just isn't playing well at all, you're not going to win every Stanley Cup playoff game 4-3, 5-4, 6-5. It's just not going to happen. You're going to have your goalie step up big in a couple of different instances. We saw Igor do that a bunch. Really throughout his entire career. I was going to mention this past year's playoff run, but he's done that ever since he's been here. So best case scenario, Igor Shesterkin comes up clutch in the playoffs the way that he's done throughout the early parts of his career thus far. And I think also in a best case scenario for Igor Shesterkin, he scores his first career goal. This one's pretty self-explanatory, but he's been close in the past, and we've gotten to a point where anytime he's got the puck at Madison Square Garden and there's an empty net, you feel the crowd start to come alive a little bit. You can almost kind of sense everybody getting out of their seats. And he's been close, man. He's only missed by, a matter of inches, at least once or twice. So, I think sooner or later he will get one. Will it happen this season? Only time's going to tell, but that would be obviously a really fun moment for Igor Shesterkin and the New York Rangers. But we're going to keep everything rolling in just a second. We're going to shift our attention to the Rangers' other goalie. That would, of course, be Jonathan Quick. And we'll talk about him and his best and worst case scenarios for this upcoming season in just a second. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Shifting our attention now to Ranger backup goalie Jonathan Quick. I think in a worst-case scenario, and this one is pretty obvious and pretty self-explanatory as far as what could happen to Jonathan Quick in a worst-case scenario, and I think a lot of you probably know where I'm going with this. Very simply, his age catches up to him. Once any pro athlete gets into their late 30s, I think this becomes at least somewhat of a concern. Can he still do this the way that he used to, years ago? 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever it might be. And I think when you play a position as demanding as NHL goalie, that probably becomes even more of a question mark. Can this guy hold up for another season? Can he get through another year, nice and healthy and playing the kind of hockey that we're used to seeing him play? And the funny thing, as I say all that, this was a worst case scenario last year for Quick as well. And I feel like with a lot of fans, there was probably an expectation that we were already at that point with Jonathan Quick. He already was kind of over the hill, and he already had gotten to a point where age caught up to him. And then, of course, last year, we saw him really kind of turn back the clock, play some excellent hockey for the Rangers, step in anytime that they needed him, came up big when Igor was going through his scuffles in January last year. But the thing is, man, you can just never count on a legend. And that's something that I've learned watching sports throughout the years, whatever sport it might be, whatever position this player happens to play. The all-time greats, they always find a way to, get the absolute most out of their abilities, whatever they've got left until the final, game that they play. And I think we saw that from Jonathan Quick last year. I think also in a worst-case scenario, Quick just can't rediscover the magic from last season. I mean, this is somewhat related to what I just talked about with the age catching up. But, it really was awesome to see last year, him obviously, again, turning back the clock and figuring out a way to get the job done. Is the first time he'd ever really been a backup, I'd say, in his life. I mean, I guess you could say the run that he had with Vegas, he got traded from the Kings to the Blue Jackets and the Blue Jackets to the Knights, and he was with the Knights for their run to the Stanley Cup final. So I guess you could say there he kind of got a little bit used to being a backup, but it's an unfamiliar role for the most part with Quick, and hopefully he continues to shine in it. But in a worst case scenario, that would not be the case. I think also in a worst case scenario, and I know this from watching Henrik Lundqvist the last few years that he played with the Rangers, the lateral movement just is not there for Jonathan Quick the way that it used to be. And again, this all goes back to his age and the fact that, he's obviously been between the pipes for a lot of games throughout his career, throughout his life. But it does seem like with Lundqvist, and this would not appear to be uncommon for really any aging goaltender, but the lateral movement is the thing that, that tends to go first, and that tends to be, an Achilles heel for a goalie. Because, with Lundqvist, I always felt like he was still seeing the game very well, and he understood where he had to be in his positioning and everything. There were times where he just couldn't get there. And I think with Jonathan Quick, much the same for any aging goalie in the NHL. That's also at least somewhat of a concern, as he once again gets into his late 30s. I mean, he's 38, he'll be 39, I believe, in January. So, yeah, hopefully that's not the case. But in a worst case scenario, the lateral movement just isn't there for Quick the way that it has been at other parts of his career. I think in a best case scenario for Jonathan Quick, and I mentioned this a while back, I did an episode where we talked about one kind of bold off-the-wall prediction for every single player on the New York Rangers. But I honestly think this could very well happen. In a best-case scenario for Jonathan Quick, he signs a one-year extension with the New York Rangers in the middle of the season. We saw it happen this past season. Got a little bit of a raise. He was near the league minimum last year. And this year coming up, I want to say he's around like $1.1 or $1.2 million. Well-deserved raise based on how he played. But he seems happy here. I feel like he's at the point where he's content mostly being a backup because he probably realizes that he just can't go the way that he used to, starting every single game like he did in his heyday with the Kings. But he seems to be absolutely loved in that locker room. I feel like he's been a good influence on Igor Shesterkin, working with him, with the mental side of the game, and somebody that's kind of emerged as a leader for the Rangers in that locker room, and somebody that you can go to in a pinch. And knock on wood here, but if anything was to happen to Igor Shesterkin in the playoffs, obviously that would be terrible. But I mentioned this last year, going into last season, when some people weren't really on board with the Rangers signing Jonathan Quick. I'll take my chances in a situation like that in the playoffs with Jonathan Quick. I'll do that long before I take my chances with just some random backup goalie who's been bouncing from team to team around the league, for the past decade. Because we've seen Jonathan Quick do it. And as I mentioned in the past, he is an all-time great. So in a best-case scenario, he continues to play well. the Rangers continue to see value in Jonathan Quick, and they bring him back on a 1-year deal. I know some people are going to say, like, well, what about Dylan Garand? Garand, he'll get his turn eventually, and I feel like if Quick came back for one more year, you could see Garand as the backup as soon as the year after that one. So that would be okay, I think. Best case scenario for Jonathan Quick, he picks up the Rangers if Igor Shesterkin goes into one of his aforementioned mid-season slumps. We saw Jonathan Quick do that last year. The Rangers were sputtering, really having some issues. Igor Shesterkin was really having some issues, just kind of fighting himself. And they put Jonathan Quick into the net for, I think it was 3 straight games. So it was sort of a benching for Igor. Now, their plan all along was very clearly to eventually go back to Igor Shesterkin, but they wanted to work on some things with Igor Shesterkin. I believe they also wanted to give him a little bit of a mental break as well. And Jonathan Quick came in, played some great hockey for the Rangers, and held down the fort while Igor was going through his struggles last season. So I don't want Igor to go through a slump in the middle of the season, but if he does, it's nice to know that Jonathan Quick is here and he can step in, take the reins, and keep the ship afloat while Igor figures out whatever he's got to figure out. I think also in a best case scenario, and I alluded to this just a minute ago, Jonathan Quick, that is, steps into, or rather maintains his role as a locker room leader. Now, again, we talked about his run in Vegas. That was the first time that he was a backup goalie, and those players raved about how good he was for that locker room. We heard some stories about that this past season with the Rangers as well. There was a story for Game 2 between the Rangers and the Canes in the second round. That was the game, went into double overtime. Rangers ended up winning. That was Trocheck. Trocheck got the game winner in double overtime while the Rangers were on the power play. And they were saying, during both intermissions, going into the overtime, going into the double overtime, Jonathan Quick was one of the most vocal players in that locker room, just really encouraging guys, dig in, keep going, don't give up, we got this, let's go, all that good stuff. And, not to say that Quick never did that at other points in his career, but when you're the starting goalie, there's so much on your plate that I feel like it's almost unfair to expect, the starting goalie, the franchise goalie, to be the one to step up and give all these rah-rah speeches. And again, I'm not saying that Quick never did that. I mean, I'm sure he did it sometime in his career, before being on the Rangers, before being on the Knights. But I think when you're the backup goalie, it frees you up a little bit to do things like that. And obviously, he's the veteran. He's the 3-time Stanley Cup champion. He's the Slam Dunk Hall of Famer. So when he talks, people are going to listen. And I think he's very valuable in that role as a locker room leader for this New York Ranger team. But figure we could pretty much call it there for today. A couple of news and notes here before we say goodbye. Artemi Panarin, as mentioned, as reported earlier today in the day here on Thursday, still listed as day-to-day. Peter Laviolette did not commit to Panarin playing on opening night. So I hope he does. But if he doesn't, keep your fingers crossed that the Rangers can figure out a way to get it done without him. And hopefully, obviously, this is not a long-term thing. And if Panarin does miss regular season games, it's not a lot of regular season games. Hopefully just 1 or 2 at the most. The good news, if you're a Brian Hoffman fan, or if you're Brian Hoffman himself, is that it sounds like Hoffman is going to play with Trocheck and Lafreniere in Friday's preseason finale. So he'll be stepping in there in place of Artemi Panarin. And if they're doing that for a game that's mostly considered like a dress rehearsal, and this is mostly the guys that you're going to see on opening night, that's a good sign for Brian Hoffman. I did not think that Brian Hoffman would make this team out of camp, but if Artemi Panarin is unavailable for opening night, and I hope he can play, but if he can't, it sounds like, they might roll the dice with Brian Hoffman and give him a real chance obviously Panarin's going to get that spot when he comes back, but they'll give Hoffman the first crack at it if Panarin cannot play. Also notable from practice, Matthew Robertson is back from injury, and it sounds like he will be in the lineup alongside Braden Schneider for the preseason finale. And I saw Vince Mercogliano threw out this idea, and I think there were some others as well, that maybe Matthew Robertson is a dark horse contender to be the number 6 defenseman on opening night. And that's certainly possible. To me, though, I feel like this is more the case of let's get Matthew Robertson one more game here because he was hurt for part of the preseason. And I get the feeling they're going to throw him out there just to give him, some more reps at the NHL level. I can't imagine, even if Matthew Robertson plays a great game, that they're going to be like, okay, let's go with Robertson over Mancini. I could be wrong about that, but based on everything that Mancini has done this preseason, I think he'll be the guy. And honestly, even Mackey, I feel like they'd probably go with Mackey before they went with Robertson at this point as well. Another bit of news here. All 4 Rangers that were placed on waivers have cleared, and will be assigned to the Hartford Wolfpack. They were Brandon Scanlon, Anton Bleed, Casey Fitzgerald, and Louis Domingue. And, I figured they would all make it through. I was a little bit worried about Louis Domingue. I thought maybe the Bruins, given everything going on between them and Swayman, they might put in a claim for Domingue. They claimed a different goalie, Yuri Patera, who has 8 career games. But I'm glad that all 4 of those players cleared. I think they'll all be, valuable contributors for the Hartford Wolfpack. And you could see these guys at the NHL level. We saw Scanlon and Bleed and Domingue last year play for the Rangers. Now, granted, it was 1 game apiece for all 3 of those players, but they still came up. And always good to have a couple of veterans in the pipeline if you need to call them up for a game or two. One more cut as well. Bogru has been cut by the Rangers and assigned to the Hartford Wolfpack. He does not have to pass through waivers on account of he has not played enough NHL games to qualify to have to go through waivers. And one last thing here. Playoff overtime stories. We're going to be doing this episode in the very near future here. I want to hear from you guys. Give me your stories from this past year's Ranger playoff run. The Rangers won 4 games in overtime. Pick one of them and tell me where you were, who you were with, what you were doing, how you celebrated when the Rangers won one of their playoff overtime games. And one other thing that I should mention here, you can always feel free to do this in audio form or in video form. Emailing me is great. That works too, and I can certainly read your story. But if you ever want to do audio or video, we can do that just as easily. So send those my way, audio form, video form, or text form. And you can email them to me or send them to me on Twitter as well. But yeah, figure we can call it there. If you guys would like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, @LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, there's @LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.